Welcome to the deep dive. We're kicking off a pretty big journey, actually, 61 parts through Western philosophy. So buckle up. Today, we're going to spend some quality time with a guy named Socrates. You've probably heard of him. Our main source is episode 11's Socrates. And we'll also be using Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, just to kind of help us understand the context a little bit better. We've got a really great mix of listeners for this deep dive. I know we've got some seasoned history buffs out there, and we've got some teenagers who are just, starting their exploration of all this stuff. So whether you're 60 or 16, get ready. You're going to discover some fascinating nuggets about Socrates' life, his teachings, and all the drama that unfolded around him. I think there's something here for everyone.
Absolutely. It's amazing to me to think that someone who lived, over 2,500 years ago can still spark debate and make us question our own beliefs. I mean, that's really the power of Socrates.
Yeah. So let's set the scene a little bit. Socrates lived during the golden age of Athens. What comes to mind when you hear that?
I mean, of course, it was a time of just incredible flourishing, in art, democracy, intellectual thought. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, Yeah. And the source material highlights Athens' reliance on imported grain, actually, which I think created a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah. So they're powerful, but they're dependent on this grain. And think about it. If you're a farmer in Athens or an artisan, and your livelihood depends on this steady supply of grain coming from somewhere else, any disruption to that trade could be disastrous.
Absolutely. And I think that, that economic vulnerability really played a role in the political and social tensions that were kind of simmering at the time. And of course, we have to consider the influence of those wealthy aristocratic families who often held power despite the democratic system, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got this vibrant society, but underneath you've got all these simmering tensions and these power struggles. And then enter Socrates, stage left, with his whole question everything approach. And the source even describes him as preferring to ask questions rather than lecture. And he was famous for claiming to, quote, know nothing. What's the deal with that? Was he just being ironic?
I think it's more complex than simple irony. I think he genuinely believed that true wisdom really begins with acknowledging your own ignorance. And by questioning everything, he challenged assumptions and really forced people to examine their beliefs.
So instead of giving people the answers, he was giving them the tools to find the answers themselves.
Yeah.
That's pretty radical, especially in a society that's used to being told what to think.
Yeah, totally. I think this approach made him both incredibly influential and incredibly controversial. Episode 11, Socrates, really makes it clear that he wasn't interested in, physical speculations, the nature of the universe and things like that. He was focused on ethics, how to live a good life, how to be a virtuous person.
I mean, yeah. If you're living in a society with all this simmering underneath, maybe the most important question isn't, what is the universe made of?
Yeah.
But how should we live together?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally agree. And Socrates wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom either. One of his most controversial teachings was the idea that no man sins willingly. What do you make of that?
Wow, that's a bold statement. I mean, it suggests that everyone has the potential for goodness.
Yeah.
But maybe they just lack the knowledge or the understanding. So act virtuously.
That's one way to interpret it. And if we connect this to the political climate of Athens, we can see how this idea might have been perceived as a threat. He's essentially saying that people can be led astray. They can be manipulated by clever rhetoric. And he's also kind of implying the Athenian democracy, susceptible as it was to persuasion, might not always choose the most virtuous path.
He's not pulling any punches.
Yeah.
And our source mentions another fascinating figure, Lycurgus, who envisioned an ideal Spartan society based on military strength, communal living, and strict education. Quite a contrast to the intellectual and artistic culture of Athens.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, while Athens prized, individual expression and democratic ideals, Sparta was all about discipline, obedience, and the collective good.
I can already imagine some heated debates among our listeners about which system is better. But it's interesting to see these two contrasting models presented side by side. It makes you think about what values a society should prioritize and what sacrifices individuals might be asked to make for the greater good.
Right. Yeah, and it really highlights, I think, the diversity of thought. Even within ancient Greece, we tend to lump them all together. But Athens and Sparta really had vastly different visions for what a good society should look like.
So we've got Socrates challenging Athenian norms, like Kyrgyz presenting a totally different model in Sparta. The stage is set for some major philosophical drama. And I'm guessing that drama reaches its climax with the trial of Socrates.
You guessed it.
Oh,
That's where things get really interesting. This man who dedicated his life to questioning everything is accused of evil doing and, quote, corrupting the youth. It's almost too perfect, isn't it?
It's like something out of a Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
But what were the real motivations behind these charges?
Yeah, it's unlikely that it was purely about, religious piety. Remember those simmering tensions we talked about? I think, Socrates' association with aristocratic families, his criticism of Athenian democracy, and his radical ideas all likely played a role in his downfall.
I mean, it makes you wonder if his accusers were more afraid of his ideas than his actions.
Right.
A thinker who questions everything, bound to make some enemies,
Yeah.
especially those in power.
Absolutely. And the source material actually includes this amazing quote from Socrates' defense, where he compares himself to a gadfly sent by God to awaken Athens. He knew he was being provocative, but he saw it as his duty to challenge complacency and make people think critically.
It's a powerful image. He's not just defending himself, he's defending the right to question, to challenge authority,
Yeah.
even if it means facing consequences.
Absolutely. And his refusal to propose a lesser penalty, accepting death instead, suggests that he was fully committed to his principles. It's a powerful statement about intellectual integrity and the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even in the face of death.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored, the political and social context of Socrates' time, his unique approach to philosophy, and the dramatic events that led to his trial. But where do we go from here?
Well, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into Socrates' philosophical ideas. We'll unpack that, know-nothing stance, explore his concept of virtue, and see how his ideas laid the groundwork for some of the most influential philosophical schools of thought in history.
I'm ready. And for our listeners, especially those who are new to philosophy, what's one key takeaway you'd like them to hold on to from this first part?
I think the biggest takeaway is that understanding a philosopher like Socrates means understanding the world he lived in. His ideas, his methods, even his trial, they all make sense. When we consider, the complex social and political and economic dynamics of Athens during the Golden Age.
Yeah. It's like we can't just parachute into ancient Greece and expect to understand Socrates without appreciating the context. It's like trying to understand a play without knowing the setting or the character's backstory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as we move forward, keep that context in mind. It'll help you appreciate the nuances of his thought and his enduring impact on Western philosophy.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us on this first part of our deep dive into Socrates. We can't wait to continue exploring his ideas and his legacy in part 2, so stay tuned.
Ready to delve deeper into the mind of Socrates.
Absolutely. Last time, we kind of set the stage, right? Golden Age Athens, all those simmering tensions, and Socrates is like the ultimate question asker. Now let's get to the good stuff, those juicy philosophical bits. His know-nothing stance, that still has me intrigued.
Yeah, it's not just a catchy phrase, though. It's really the foundation of his entire philosophical approach.
So if he's claiming to know nothing, how can he teach anyone anything?
See, that's the brilliance of it. By admitting his own ignorance, Socrates opened up space for genuine inquiry. He believed that true knowledge came not from, rote memorization or blind faith, but from a willingness to question, to probe, to just relentlessly seek understanding.
So it's like he's saying, don't take my word for it, think for yourself. Pretty radical for his time, right?
Definitely, especially in a society where authority and tradition held a lot of sway. Socrates challenged people to examine their own beliefs, to test their assumptions, to never stop seeking the truth.
And this all ties back to his focus on ethics.
Yeah.
Or it's not just about accumulating knowledge for the sake of it. It's about using that knowledge to live a better, more virtuous life.
Exactly. Socrates believed that knowledge and virtue were inextricably linked. He argued that true knowledge naturally leads to right action. In other words, if you truly understand what is good and just, you'll act accordingly.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also sets a pretty high bar for what it means to be knowledgeable. It's not just about knowing the facts. It's about internalizing those facts and letting them guide your behavior.
Right, and that's where his famous method of questioning comes in. the Socratic method, as it's known. It wasn't about lecturing or preaching. It was about engaging in dialogue, asking probing questions, and challenging people to think critically about their own beliefs.
So he was more of a philosophical sparring partner than a sage on a stage.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. He would pose a question, listen carefully to the answer, and then ask another question that exposed a flaw in the reasoning, or like a hidden assumption.
Like intellectual judo, using your opponent's momentum against them.
Exactly. And by doing so, he forced people to confront their own inconsistencies, their own biases, and to ultimately arrive at a more nuanced understanding of the issue at hand.
I can see how that would be both enlightening and incredibly frustrating.
Oh, it certainly was. Socrates was known for being relentless in his pursuit of truth. And he didn't let anyone off easy, not even his closest friends and students.
No wonder he ended up on trial. Speaking of which,
Yeah.
his trial raises some interesting questions about the limits of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
And that tension between individual thought and societal norms.
Yeah.
Even in a democracy like Athens, there were lines you just couldn't cross.
Yeah. It's a tension that exists in every society, right? How do we balance the need for order and stability with the right to dissent, to question authority, to challenge the status quo?
It's a question that's still relevant today. In a world where we're constantly grappling with issues like censorship, political polarization, the spread of misinformation.
Absolutely, and it makes Socrates' story all the more relevant, right?
Yeah.
He reminds us that the pursuit of truth often comes at a cost, and those who dare to question the prevailing narratives are often met with resistance, sometimes even persecution.
It's a sobering thought. But it also makes me wonder, what would Socrates make of our modern world? I mean, with all the information at our fingertips, the echo chambers of social media, and the speed at which ideas spread. Would he be excited by the possibilities or horrified by the chaos?
It's a great question. I imagine he'd have a lot to say about our modern world, with all of its complexities and contradictions.
Oh, yeah. I bet he'd be both fascinated and frustrated. On one hand, we have access to more information than ever before, but on the other hand, it's easy to get lost in the noise, to retreat into our own echo chambers, and to avoid engaging in meaningful dialogue across differences.
Yeah, and I think he'd be quick to point out the dangers of mistaking information for knowledge, of confusing opinion with truth, and of letting emotion and bias cloud our judgment.
So even with all the tools and technology we have today, those Socratic virtues of critical thinking, self-reflection, and a willingness to engage in open dialogue, they're more important than ever.
Absolutely. Socrates reminds us that true knowledge is a process. It's a journey, a constant striving for understanding. It's not something you can just download or passively consume. It requires active engagement, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge your own assumptions.
So in a way, Socrates' legacy isn't just about the specific ideas he espoused, it's about the way he approached the world, with curiosity, humility, and a relentless pursuit of truth.
That's a great way to put it. He modeled a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that continues to inspire and challenge us even today.
And I think that's what makes this 61-part journey so exciting. We're not just learning about historical figures, we're engaging with ideas that have shaped Western thought for centuries. Ideas that are still relevant and alive today.
Right, it's like we're having a conversation across time and space with some of the greatest minds in history.
I like that. And who knows, maybe by engaging with these ideas, by questioning, challenging, and debating, maybe we even become a little bit wiser ourselves. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's bring it back to Socrates for a sec. We've talked a lot about his method, his focus on ethics. But what were some of his specific teachings? What did he actually believe about the world and our place in it?
Well, one of his key teachings was the idea that the soul is immortal. He believed that the true self, the part of us that thinks and reasons, is not bound by the physical body and continues to exist after death.
That's a pretty radical concept, especially in a world that was so focused on the here and now. What led him to believe that?
Well, Socrates was fascinated by the nature of knowledge and how we come to know things. He argued that true knowledge isn't something we acquire through our senses, but something that's innate, something we're born with.
So it's not like learning facts from a book or observing the world around us. It's more like remembering something we already know deep down.
Exactly. He used the example of geometry to illustrate his point. You know, when we learn about geometric principles, we're not really discovering anything new. We're simply recollecting knowledge that our souls already possessed in a previous existence.
Whoa, that's mind-blowing. It suggests we have this vast reservoir of knowledge within us just waiting to be unlocked.
And Socrates believed that the pursuit of knowledge, the quest for truth, was the highest calling of the soul. He saw it as a process of purification, a way of freeing ourselves from the illusions and distractions of the material world and connecting with something deeper, something eternal.
So it's almost like a spiritual journey, even though he wasn't talking about religion in like the conventional sense.
Right, and this idea of the soul's immortality had a profound impact on subsequent philosophers, especially Plato, who developed it into a sophisticated theory of forms.
Forms. That sounds intriguing, but I think we'll save that for another deep dive. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea that true knowledge is a form of recollection. It's making me question everything I thought I knew.
That's the beauty of Socrates. He challenges us to rethink our assumptions, to delve deeper into our own beliefs, to never stop asking questions.
I like it. That's a pretty good place to leave it for this part of our deep dive. We've explored the Socratic method, his focus on ethics, and his belief in the immortality of the soul. What's one key takeaway you'd like our listeners to ponder as we move into the next part?
I think the key takeaway is that Socrates believed in the power of human reason to discover truth. He challenged us to engage in rigorous self-examination, to question everything, and to never settle for easy answers.
Powerful stuff. So for all our listeners out there, whether you're seasoned philosophers or just starting your journey, take a moment to reflect on your own beliefs. What are your assumptions? What are your blind spots? And what are you willing to question in the pursuit of truth?
Because that, my friend, is the essence of the Socratic spirit.
Beautifully said. Join us for the next part of our deep dive as we explore the impact of Socrates' ideas on his students, particularly Plato, and how his legacy continues to shape Western thought to this day.
Ready to wrap up our deep dive into Socrates?
Oh, I'm feeling like I've gone through a mental workout. We covered like his know-nothing stance, his focus on ethics, the drama of his trial, and that wild idea that knowledge is actually like a form of recollection. So what else can you tell us about his legacy?
You know, it's incredible to think someone who never wrote anything down could have such a profound and lasting impact. And Socrates' influence wasn't just about specific doctrines or theories, it was really more about his way of thinking, his whole approach to life, really.
So less about what he taught and more about how he taught.
Exactly. He modeled a way of engaging with the world that really emphasized critical thinking, self-reflection, and this like relentless pursuit of truth. And this approach had a profound impact on his students, particularly Plato.
Ah, Plato. He's the one who actually wrote stuff down, right? I kind of remember reading some of his dialogues in a philosophy class. They were pretty intense.
Yeah, intense, but brilliant. Plato was deeply influenced by Socrates, for sure. But he also developed his own unique philosophical system. He took Socrates' ideas about the immortality of the soul and the nature of knowledge and kind of expanded them into a sophisticated theory of forms.
Okay, remind me, what are forms again?
So, in a nutshell, Plato believed that the physical world we perceive with our senses is just a shadow of a higher realm of perfect, unchanging forms.
So like the chair I'm sitting on is just an imperfect copy of the ideal form of chairness that exists like out there somewhere.
Exactly. And this applies to all concepts, not just physical objects. Justice, beauty, truth. These are all forms that exist independently of our perception. They're eternal, unchanging, and perfect.
Whoa. That's kind of a mind-bending concept. Like there's this whole other level of reality that we can only access through like reason and philosophical contemplation.
And for Plato, the goal of philosophy was to ascend to that higher realm, to escape the illusions of the physical world and connect with the true essence of things.
It sounds almost like a spiritual quest.
It definitely has a mystical element to it. And this idea of like transcending the limitations of our senses and our physical bodies to access a higher truth. You know, it's a theme that runs throughout Western philosophy and religion.
Yeah. I could see how that would appeal to people. It suggests that there's more to life than meets the eye, that there's something deeper, something more meaningful to strive for.
And it's important to remember, Socrates and Plato were living in a world that was undergoing tremendous change. The old certainties were breaking down, and people were searching for new ways to understand their place in the cosmos.
So their ideas weren't just abstract theories, they were a response to, like, the challenges and anxieties of their time.
Exactly. And that's why their ideas still resonate with us today. We're still grappling with many of the same questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and how to live a good life in a world that's constantly changing.
You know what? I'm starting to see how this journey through Western philosophy, it's going to be so much more than just a history lesson. It's a chance to engage with these, like, timeless questions that have shaped human thought for centuries.
Absolutely. And to see how these ideas have evolved, been challenged, reinterpreted, and continue to influence us today.
So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
We've covered Socrates, we touched on Plato, but there are 61 parts to this deep dive. What other philosophical giants await us?
Well, after Plato, we'll explore Aristotle. He was Plato's student. But he also developed his own distinct philosophical system. And then we'll delve into the Hellenistic schools of thought, like Stoicism and Epicureanism, which offer practical guidance for living a good life and, a turbulent world.
And I'm guessing we'll eventually make our way to the Romans, the rise of Christianity, and all the twists and turns of philosophical thought throughout history.
You got it. It's going to be an epic journey through the evolution of ideas, a grand tour of the human mind, grappling with, the biggest questions of existence.
I can't wait. And for our listeners who are joining us on this adventure, what's one key takeaway you'd like them to remember from our deep dive into Socrates?
I think the most important thing is that Socrates reminds us that the unexamined life is not worth living. He challenged us to question everything, to be intellectually curious, and to never stop seeking truth.
Beautifully said. And as we continue our journey through Western philosophy, remember to bring that Socratic spirit of inquiry with you. Question, challenge, debate, and never be afraid to change your mind.
Because that's how we grow, that's how we learn, and that's how we keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating episode, exploring another corner of this vast and ever-evolving world of philosophy. Until then, happy pondering.